So whether you're learning a language or learning how to code, the techniques and methods that you use can not only affect how quickly you learn, but also how much of that learning you retain. In this video, I'm going to give you 5 of the best scientifically supported techniques to study and learn more efficiently and effectively. Hey guys, it's Ahmed and welcome back to my channel where I sift through the noise to bring you topics that affect our day-to-day lives to make you just a little bit more informed and productive. If you're new here, please consider subscribing to my channel so you can stay up to date on the videos that I make. For those of you who don't know, I'm an AI researcher at Cambridge University where I look at how technology and AI can work more effectively with education. I'm particularly interested in knowing what kind of educational practices work and which ones don't, especially because we're going to be building these into technology and we don't want to be propagating techniques that aren't actually proven to help students learn more effectively. So it's the new year and a lot of people during this time make New Year's resolutions, whether it's learning a new language or learning a new skill. In the past, whenever I've done this, I've stopped before I've even gotten anywhere. I've never really gone through with these New Year's resolutions. And I think one of the main reasons is because I feel like given the time that I've invested in learning these skills, I didn't really feel like I got the output that I was hoping for. During my PhD, which was focused on how AI and technology can work better with education, I came across this paper by a professor named John Dunlosky, who was a psychology professor at Kent State University. And he wrote this fantastic paper called What Works and What Doesn't. Him and his team analyzed 700 scientific articles where they look at 10 different methods of learning and they compare them. And he presents a ranked list of the best ways to learn. I've linked that in the description below. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the 5 best methods that his team identified to learn more efficiently and effectively. Number 1 on the list is self-testing. Self-testing can be done using flashcards, whether they're digital or paper-based, using the questions at the end of the textbook, or even creating your own test. It was found that students who use self-testing performed far better on examinations, and they retained information for much longer after the exam as well. As a matter of fact, it was found that self-testing can even help improve the retention and memory of those patients suffering from Alzheimer's. In the paper, they talk about how students who use self-testing as a method of studying, when compared to students who used a method like a passive review strategy, performed far better. What I mean by that is, say you were learning French and you're looking at word pairs where on the left side it says English words and on the right side it says the French translation. Now, by testing yourself, by covering one side of the row saying, right, what word is this in French or what word is this in English, you are far likely to remember that content than in comparison to where you're just looking at the word and you're like, right, that's the French word, that's the English word, that's the French word, that's the English word. So although they don't talk about this thing specifically in the paper, when you test yourself, you sort of force your mind to improve your recall. Number 2 on the list is distributed practice. What distributed practice says is that it's much better to space out your learning over a period of time than to try to cram everything in a few days. So instead of reviewing a language on day 1, 2, and 3, it's much better to review on day 1, day 2, day 4, day 8. In fact, there's a whole technique around this called spaced repetition learning. Its origins actually date back to 1885 when a psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus discovered the forgetting curve. What he found out by testing on himself was that humans forget at like an exponential rate. The way to counter that, future psychologists found the spaced repetition technique. In spaced repetition, you continually increase the spacing between your review strategies. So if you learn something on day 1, then the next time you review is on day 2, and then the next time you review it after that is on day 4, and so on and so forth. These first 2 techniques were what Dunlosky called the winner techniques, and these were the best techniques of the bunch. The next techniques that I'm going to talk about are called runner-ups. So they're not as effective as the first 2 techniques, but they're pretty effective nonetheless. Number 3 on the list is elaborative interrogation. In this technique, you ask yourself why. So when you're learning something factual, it helps to ask yourself, why is that the case? There was a man who drove into the car and drove to the restaurant. Why? Well, because he was hungry. Why? Because he hadn't eaten in 8 hours. So asking yourself these questions like why and interrogating the situation, that's why it's called elaborative interrogation, allows you to build memory maps between the content. It allows you to bridge links between different sentences and different pieces of factual information. This methodology is particularly effective when you're learning factual information. It might not be as effective when you're learning a language or something like that. So if you're studying for something that requires you to have some form of reading comprehension, and you're supposed to remember particular pieces of information and how they're related together, then using elaborative interrogation is a good technique. Number 4 on the list is self-explanation. In this technique, you're trying to understand how different pieces of information are related together. So this new piece of information that you just received, how does it relate to what you already know? Let's take the example of AI. So if you watched my first video, then you would have seen that AI is essentially a way to emulate the human behavior. There are loads of different methods that you can use to understand AI. You might be using rule-based systems. You might be using machine learning. If you're using machine learning, you might have other techniques within machine learning, for example, deep learning. And deep learning is composed of things like neural networks. So how those things all relate together is kind of what you do in self-explanation. These sorts of techniques are incredibly helpful when you're doing logical-based puzzles or trying to understand strategies. So for example, if you're doing something like learning chess strategies, because you're a big fan of Queen's Gambit, then you might use self-explanation as a way to improve your understanding and your retention. Number 5 on the list is interleaved practice. Now, what that means is that instead of learning all about triangles and then moving on to squares and then learning all about squares and then moving on to rhombuses, it's much more effective to interleave between them. So learn about triangles and squares and rhombus and then move back to triangles and then squares and rhombus. So interleaving that practices allows you to understand and retain information for longer. So if we want to understand why interleaving is a good strategy for learning, or even why distributed practice is a good technique, then we want to understand how memory works. So one of the theories that you need to know about is this theory called interference theory. What interference theory says is that the more memory cues we have for a particular piece of content, the more likely we are to remember it. So let's say we forget our keys at home. We come back to the house and we try to retrace our steps to figure out where we left the keys. So we went through the door, we were at the desk, then we went to the bedroom, then we were on the bed, and we realized, oh right, I left my keys on the bedside table. Each of those steps is a memory cue. The other thing about interference theory is that it says that the more the context has changed, the more likely we are to remember. So let's say we're trying to learn the word cat. So if we're sitting in front of a computer looking at a picture of a cat and saying, yes, this is a cat, then we have a memory cue right there looking at this particular image. And we also have the cues of the environment. So we're sitting in our desk, it might be night, it might be cold. These are all different memory cues that our mind uses to remember this experience. Now, the further away in time our next reviewal for the word cat is, the more likely things are to change. So it might be different weather, we might be in a different location, we might be looking at a different picture of a cat, and then we might say, yes, this is a cat. That creates more memory cues. And now we have multiple memory cues leading us to cat. So this enables our memory to recall much better. And this is why interleaving and distributed practices can be seen as effective methods of retention and recall. Learning effectively and efficiently can not only help us save time, but can also make us less frustrated and anxious about learning a new skill. I can't tell you how many times I've been disappointed when I make a New Year's resolution and don't go through with it. But if we at least had the right techniques to learn, then I'm not saying that just because I know these 5 techniques, I'll definitely not drop my New Year's resolutions, but I do think that it will reduce my likelihood of being frustrated because of lack of progress. I think one of the biggest issues in our educational system today is that we never really get taught how to learn. Yes, we get thrown loads of information at us from a small age, even at university, but no teacher has ever taught us how to actually learn. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that even teachers haven't been taught what are the best techniques to really learn. So if any of you have used any of the techniques that I've mentioned and have anecdotal evidence for how well they've worked, then please let me know in the comments below, and any other techniques that you might have used otherwise that have been helpful. Also, if you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel and give me a thumbs up. Till next time.